Hi, welcome to another episode of Anatomy video series, and today we're gonna look at and discuss the skull, the cranium, and composed of the cranial bones. And basically, there are a variety of bones that make up the cranium or the cranial bones, and totally there are 22 bones. And we divide the cranium, or the total cranial bones, we divide them into two categories. One, the neurocranium, which is the bones that are located above, and we have the viscerocranium or splanchnicranium, which the bones that comprises or make up the facial skeleton. So there are total amount of bones is 22, and 14 of these are composed of the facial skeleton, and 8 would be the bones that make up the neurocranium. So we're going to look at these bones independently, one by one, in a closer view. So basically, if you look at the front of the skull, we see the facial skeletal bones, and all these cranial bones come together, and they make what we call sutures. They attach to each other, articulate with each other, and they make these sutures. And basically, these cranial bones are immovable. So there are independent bones, yes, and they're attached to each other. They're articulate with each other, but they don't move. Okay, so all these articulations are immovable joints. One exception is the mandible. Mandible here, as you can see, is the lower jaw, and this is movable. All right, now we're going to look at that again independently. And this mandible attaches to the temporal bone, forming the temporomandibular joint, and this is movable. So this is the only exception. So the rest of the bones are immovable. They're attached firmly with each other, except mandible, which makes up the lower jaw. Okay, so we're going to look at the sutures. So at the front, what we're going to look at independently a bit later would be like we have the frontal bone, as you can see. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these bones independently according to the view. So we have the frontal view of the skull. All right, we're going to look at this side. And then we have the lateral view of the skull. We're going to look at this side. And then we have the occipital view, the posterior view of the skull. All right, so we're going to look at the structures on this side. And then we're going to look at the skull from the top, from the superior view, what we call this the bird's eye. And we're going to get rid of the vault. Okay, this is the calaveria, the upper part, the cap of the skull. We're going to take it out, and we're going to look at the skull from the superior, and look at the interior view of the base of the skull. And then we're going to look at the skull from the inferior aspect, the inferior view of the base of the skull. So we're going to look at the skull in various directions and various orientation, so you can get oriented on the structures that are involved in the formation of the skull. All right. So what we see here, basically, as a just by looking at it, what we see, we have the frontal bone here. Okay, and then we have the cheekbone. Okay, this prominent part of the cheekbone, which is the zygomatic bone. So we have the frontal bone, zygomatic bone. We have the maxillary bone here at the center, maxillary bone, and this maxillary bone here attaches to the frontal bone here. Just next to the frontal bone, we have the lacrimal bone. I'm sorry, we have the nasal bone here on the middle. The median part is the nasal bone, next to the maxillary bone. Next to the maxillary bone, just medial to in the orbit, we have the lacrimal bone. And this is the upper jaw. This is the maxilla, and this is the lower jaw, the mandible. And if you look at the orbit, the bony orbit basically is composed of a variety of bones. We have the frontal bone, we have the maxillary bone, zygomatic bone, and then we have the sphenoid inside. So we're going to look at that again independently. And this is the nasal aperture here, And basically this area, it's open, and it's filled normally in adult life. It's filled with tissue, the skin and the cartilaginous structure. So if you don't see this cartilaginous and the skin part, if you see this aperture, this is called the piriform aperture, primarily composed of the maxillary notch. This is the maxillary notch of the maxillary bone, and then we have the upper part. It's composed of the root, the nasal bone. This is the root of the nose. Okay, so that's what we see here. And on the lateral side, we see the temporal bone. Okay, this is the tempora area where you have the whitish area of your head. This is the temporal bone. Okay, this is the zygomatic arch. A zygomatic arch, basically, zygote. It comes from the zygote. Zygote means, as you know, the union of sperm and the egg. You have the formation of zygote. So this is basically the union of zygomatic bone and the union of a part of the temporal bone. They come together, they form this arch, zygomatic arch. And zygoma, or zygomatic bone, is also referred to as, it unites with several variety of bones, both above, laterally, anteriorly, and below zygomatic bone. Zygomatic arch, this is the temporal bone. We have the mastoid process here. We have external auditory meatus here. This is the where your external ear is located. So this is the ear. The pinna, what we call it pinna. Okay, so this is the meatus, external auditory meatus, external acoustic meatus, goes inside the ear canal. Okay, this is the parietal bone here on either side. So we have the temporal bone, parietal bone. So you have two parietal bones, right? And then you have the occipital bone at the back. Okay, so parietal bones is at the bones on either side. Okay, so this is the big bone. The parietal means parietal, like parietal pericardium, parietal pleura, meaning the layer that covers the body from outside. So this is basically two important bones that covers the brain from the outside. This is the parietal bone. Here is the occipital bone. Okay, so this is the lateral view. So basically, and then we have a couple of bones inside, which is the ethmoid bone, and then we have the bones of the we have the vomer here, and then we have the middle and inferior. Well, we have the inferior concha, which forms the lateral part of the nasal cavity. Okay, so we're going to look at all these bony particles and bones closer a bit later. We're going to view these areas in details a bit later. Okay, and now we're going to look at the sutures. Okay, so we have the coronal suture. Okay, and then we have the sagittal suture, lambdoidal suture, and then we have the squamous suture on the side. Okay, squamous suture, coronal suture, sagittal suture, and lambdoidal suture. We have the posterior fontanelle, anterior fontanelle. We have the pterion and asterion. Pterion and asterion. We're going to look at those a bit closer a bit later. Okay, so that's about it. So this is the gross appearance of the skull. And by the way, the skull is attached or articulated with the first vertebra, and this is the atlas. Okay, and they have these condyles. They're attached to with the condyles of the occipital bone attached to the superior articular fascia, the first vertebra, and with this articulation you have the nodding of the head via this articulation. Okay, so we articulate with the first vertebra. Okay. Okay, that's about it. So now let's look at all these independent structures a bit closer, and we'll understand all these different parts of the bone and protrusions and all these different aspects in detail. Okay, let's start. Okay, let's get started now. So this is the skull. So we have, okay, let's look at, so this is the frontal bone here. All right, this is the squama of the frontal bone, and then we have the two parietal bones on either side, and then we have the occipital bone at the back here, and on the side we have the temporal bone. Okay, so this is the squama part of the portion of the temporal bone here, and this is sphenoid, the greater ring of sphenoid, and this here is the frontal bone. So this is basically the upper part of the cranium. Okay, so this part here, we're going to take this out, and this is the calvaria, or it's also referred to as the vault of the cranium. Before that, let's look at the suture. So we have the suture. This is the coronal suture. All right. So coronal suture basically divides the frontal bone and the two parietal bones, because it's a coronal suture. And it comes from the name of the corona of the head of the owner of a land. Anyhow, so this is the coronal suture, okay, and this is the sagittal suture. So this is basically the coronal plane. I remember when we learned about these the planes of the body. So we have this section. These are the coronal sections. All right. So it basically divides the body from anterior to posterior. Okay. So this is the coronal suture, and this is the sagittal suture. Sagittal suture basically is a plane that divides the human body into right and left halves. So the sagittal suture is basically located between the two parietal bones. So this is a right parietal, left parietal, and these are attached to each other with this suture. And this suture is the sagittal suture. At the back we have the and then we have the lambdoidal suture. So this is the lambdoidal suture. Okay, so in Latin it's the symbol is designated as the Y symbol, or the inverted Y. So this is the Y or the inverted V. Okay, so it represents the lambdoid. So this is the lambdoidal suture. All right. So the lambdoidal suture basically differentiates or attaches the parietal and the occipital bone. So this is the right parietal, left parietal, and this is the occipital bone. So we have the lambdoidal suture. All right. On the lateral side, we have the squamous suture, which is this. Okay, this is the squamous suture. Squamous suture basically divides the parietal from temporal bone. So this is the temporal bone, the squamous part of the temporal bone, and this is the parietal bone. So this is squamous suture. All right. So after birth, soon after birth, all these sutures, they become ossified. But in certain areas, ossification is not basically completed, and we call these areas as soft spot areas, or soft areas, which are the frontal, and we call these areas as fontanelles. So we have the anterior fontanelle, posterior fontanelle, and then we have the anterior lateral, anterior posterior fontanelle. So anterior fontanelle is also called the bregma, and it basically the specific area is where the coronal suture comes together or unites with the sagittal suture. So in this area we have the bregma, and in this area after birth, this area is composed of connective tissue, and this is called the bregma. And basically this is the area where it ossifies later than the other soft spot areas, which is like 18 to 24 months. Okay, so that's like after 2 years, 1 or 2 years, it ossifies. All right, this is the last area that ossifies, bregma. And then this is anterior fontanelle. Posterior fontanelle is at the back. Okay, this is where the lambdoidal suture is located, and it unites with the sagittal suture. This is the posterior fontanelle. Posterior fontanelle is the earliest area that ossifies, like 2 to 3 months after birth. It ossifies. And then we have the anterior lateral fontanelle, just located somewhere around here. All right, anterior lateral fontanelle. and anterolateral fontanelle, and this is the area where you have the pterion, and I'm going to talk about the pterion. So this is the anterolateral fontanelle. This ossifies like 3 to 6 months after birth, and you have the posterior lateral fontanelle. Again, this is the same ossification period, like 3 to 6 months. All right. So the early ossification is the posterior fontanelle, and then we have the anterolateral and posterolateral. It comes after that, while the latest ossification occurs at the bregma area. So these fontanelles areas, spot areas, basically is important in the development of the brain. So after birth, brain is still enlarging. It's getting bigger. So as this becomes possible, so it pushes the skull outward. So in order to do that, so you need to have these connective tissue areas in order for the brain to expand. And also going through the birth canal and squeezing the skull, it also enables and allows the skull to pass through the birth canal easily. All these fontanelles. Okay, this area, like I said, is also called pterion. Okay, so I don't know if you can. Okay, let's look at this side here. So this area is called the pterion. Pterion is basically is attached by various bones. So we have the frontal bone, we have the parietal bone, temporal bone, and sphenoid bone. Okay, so we have all these sutures, and so all these sutures coming together. So this area here is basically called the pterion. Pterion is an important landmark in that just behind that we have the middle meningeal artery. So in terms of when this area gets fractured, all right, so the middle meningeal artery would also will be damaged and affected. So there would be a hemorrhage, and this hemorrhage would be will go to the extradural area. So we have the extradural hematoma when this area gets fractured. When you hit your side head when enter in the car accidents on the mirror, so you might have a fracture of these pterion areas. And also, like brain surgeons tend to make if there's an intradural or intracranial pressure, high intracranial pressure, they would go in and then release the amount of fluid from here, so they would reduce the intracranial pressure too. So pterion is an important landmark and area, clinically important. Okay, so that's pterion. Asterion is at the posterior lateral side. Okay, so this is the sutures. So let's look at the now. Let's look at the entry aspect of the bone. So we have the neurocranium and splanchnicranium. Okay, so neurocranium basically. Okay, let me get this out. So this is the vault. Okay, this is the calvaria. Okay, the top of the cap of the cranium. Okay, so the basically the neurocranium is composed of 8 bones. So we have 2 paired bones, all right, and the rest would be the unpaired bones. So we have 2 pairs, the parietal bones, unpaired. Okay, and then we have the frontal bone, and we have the occipital bone, we have the temporal bone, all right, and then we have the ethmoidal bone, all right. This is the ethmoidal bone. We have the sphenoidal bone, and then we have the occipital bone. So these are the 8 cranial bones that make up the neurocranium. So we have the frontal bone. So this is a part of the sphenoid here, and this is part of the occipital bone here. This is the occipital bone, and we have the temporal and parietal bones. So this is the neurocranium, which is directly involved with the brain, covers the brain. And then we have the facial skeleton, the viscerocranium or splanchnicranium, which are 14 in number. And then we have 2 unpaired, and the rest are paired. 2 unpaired would be the mandible. So the first bone that we have here is the mandible. Okay, this is the unpaired viscerocranium. And then we have the vomer. So this bone here is the vomer. And this vomer basically is located in the nasal cavity, and it's part of the it forms a part of the nasal septum. So this is the nasal septum, all right, and it divides the nasal cavity into two halves, left and right half, all right. And this is the other part of the bony part of the nasal septum, the perpendicular ethmoid, and then we have the vomer. And the rest of the nasal septum is composed of cartilage, so we don't see cartilage here. So this is the vomer, okay, and the other one is the mandible. So the mandible and vomer are unpaired facial bones, part of the facial bones, mandible and vomer, and the rest are the maxillary bone. As you can see, this is the maxillary bone. Okay, this is the nasal bone here. Zygomatic bone here. Zygomatic bone, or zygoma, also referred to as zygoma. And then we have the lacrimal bone here, lacrimal bone. And then we have the inferior nasal concha here. Inferior nasal concha is also forms the that lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So these are the basically makes up the facial bones. So let's look at them one by one now. So let's look at the view area. So the first, this is the anterior view of the skull. What we see on the anterior view, we see the frontal bone here. Okay, so this is the frontal bone. So in the frontal bone, okay, so we have the squama of the frontal bone here, and we have these prominence on either side of the orbit of the upper part of the orbit. We have, and this is called the superciliary arch or supraorbital ridge. So this is called the supraorbital ridge or superciliary arch. Okay, this is where your upper frowning upper brow eyebrow is located. And then we have, in between these superciliary arch, in between that we have this a small elevation of bony protrusion here, which is called the glabella. So this area here is called the glabella, all right? And so this is the frontal bone. Frontal bone here unites with the nasal bone here, and you have this suture here. So in where the frontal bone meets the two nasal bones here, and this is called the nasion. Okay, so with the union of the frontal and the nasal bone, this is called the nasion. Okay, and then we have at the frontal bone we have the frontal tuber, which is this area. We have two bony elevation on either side. Okay, so we have over here and over here. You can feel that in your head too. Two bony elevations here. Okay, there's two number, and this is called the frontal tuber. So this is the frontal tuber on either side, superciliary arch, glabella, nasion. All right. So this is the squamous part of the frontal bone. Okay, and then we have this supraorbital notch just above the orbit, the superior border of the orbit. We have two notches, and this is also referred to as the foramen. Yeah, we can call this supraorbital foramen or supraorbital notch. Okay, and through the supraorbital foramen or supraorbital notch, we have the supraorbital or orbital nerves and vessels pass through there. Just medial to it, you have the supratrochlear nerve pass through or innervate the medial side, and we have the supraorbital nerve comes out and then innervates this area of the forehead. Okay, so we have the supraorbital notch or supraorbital foramen on the superior margin of the bony orbit. Okay, let's look at the bony orbit now. So we have four margins. We have the supraorbital margin, we have the infraorbital margin, we have the lateral margin, and then we have the medial margin, right? So supraorbital margin, as you can see here, and well, but by the way, so this is the bony orbit. So we're going to look at that bony orbit in the next courses. So the bony orbit basically is composed of, is made out of like, or the structure of the bone resembles a pyramid. So we have the apex and the base, all right, of this bony orbit. So we have the apex right head, and then we have this part here is the base where the eyeball is located. This is the base. So basically the roof of the bony orbit is primarily composed of the orbital plate of the frontal bone. So this is the frontal bone, and the roof of the orbital plate is formed by the orbital plate of the frontal bone, and also makes up the superior orbital margin, the frontal bone. All right. Okay, and then we have the lateral orbital margin. Is composed of this bone here, which is the maxilla primarily, and the inferior orbital margin is composed again. The lateral orbital margin is composed of the zygomatic bone here. This is the zygomatic bone. The lateral orbital margin, zygomatic bone. The inferior orbital margin is composed of maxilla. Then medial orbital margin is composed of these bones here. Maxilla, we have the lacrimal bone here, maxilla, and part of the frontal bone. Okay, so what else do we have here? Okay, so we have this is called the piriform aperture. All right, and piriform aperture is basically the opening of the nasal cavity, and it's formed by two important bones. So this is the maxilla on either side, and above we have the nasal bone. Okay, on top. So nasal bone forms the root of the nose, and this is the piriform aperture. And piriform aperture on the below we have a spine here, and this is called the intranasal spine of the maxilla. So this is the maxilla, and it's the intranasal spine of the maxilla. And so this is the nasal. So this is the piriform aperture, but this is the nasal notch of the maxilla. So this is nasal notch, and normally this is composed of, like, skin and cartilaginous structure. So after cartilage and skin is devoid in this area, you have this opening, or what we call as the piriform aperture. Okay, so this is the maxilla. Inside the maxilla, just below the inferior orbital margin, we have another foramen here. We have the infraorbital foramen. So we have supraorbital foramen over here on the frontal bone, and we have the infraorbital foramen in the maxillary bone below. Okay, so in terms of maxilla, so this is the zygoma or zygomatic bone. So my zygomatic bone, like I told you earlier, zygote, it unites with a lot of bones. It unites with the maxillary bone, it unites with the frontal bone, and at the back it unites with the temporal bone. So we have the maxillary process, we have we have the maxillary process here of the zygomatic bone, we have the frontal process, and then we have the temporal process. All these processes basically unites with the other bone. So the maxillary process of zygomatic bone unites with the zygomatic process of the maxillary bone, right here. And again here, so you have, this is the suture. So we have the frontal process of zygomatic bone, and then we have the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, and these two processes unite over here on the upper part. On the lateral side, again, we have the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and then we have on the temporal side, on the temporal bone here, would be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So basically, these two processes both belong to zygomatic bone and the temporal bone, and these two processes unite, and they form what we call as arch. So this is called the zygomatic arch. Okay, so this is a zygomatic bone, and this is a cheekbone, the protrusion of the bone on either side, cheekbone, and this is called the temporal process zygomatic bone. This is the zygomatic process of temporal bone. They two unite and they form what we call a zygomatic arch. And basically, zygomatic arch forms a boundary of the infratemporal fossa. So this is a temporal bone, and this area here is basically the temporal fossa, and below that we have the infratemporal fossa. Okay, so this is the temporal fossa, and below the zygomatic arch is the infratemporal fossa. We have another foramen here, zygomatic temporal foramen, where you have the nerve passing through this area here. Okay, so let's get to the again coming back to the maxilla. So in the maxilla we have so it unites over here with the nasal bone at the back. It unites with the again it unites with the zygomatic bone laterally with the zygomatic process. And then we have in the maxilla we have alveolar process. So basically maxilla has the frontal process here. Okay, so this is maxilla. It unites with the frontal bone here. So this is the frontal process. We have the zygomatic process, and then we have the alveolar process. Alveolar process basically is where you have the where the the alveolar sockets or the tooth sockets are located, where the tooth are embedded inside these sockets. So we have the alveolar sockets, and basically this makes up the upper jaw. Okay. So we have the alveolar socket, alveolar process. We have the zygomatic process. We have the frontal process of the maxilla, and then we have the palatine process. We're going to look at that when we look at the base of the skull. We have the again palatine process. So all these processes are basically part of the maxillary bone, and it forms the upper jaw of the face of the skeletal. Okay, so that's the maxilla. We talked about the zygomatic bone. We talked about the nasal bone, all right? We talked about the nasal bone. And so this is the maxilla. Just behind the maxilla over here, which is part of the middle part of the orbit, with this bone, this small bone is called the lacrimal bone. And if you look at the, there's this fossa here, and this fossa basically lodges, or it's filled with a sac, what we call this lacrimal sac. So this is the lacrimal sac where you have the fluid of the eye tears basically is present and inside this inside the sac. So you have the eye, we have the tears coming out from this lacrimal sac. Okay, so this is lacrimal bone, and if you look at it, there's a canal here. This is the nasolacrimal canal or nasolacrimal duct. So this sac, after the tears comes out from the sac, it goes through this nasolacrimal duct, okay, and it opens to the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. Beneath the inferior meatus, so this is the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. It opens to that area. So when you cry, basically you also sniff. That tear would basically go to the lateral part of the nasal cavity, or to your nose. Okay. So this is nasal lacrimal bone here. Okay. Next bone is the mandible. So this mandible here, as you can see, is composed of the lower jaw. All right. So mandible is one of the strongest and the movable bone of the visceral cranium. So this is the mandible here, and basically mandible is composed of the body. So this is the body of the mandible, and this is the ramus of the mandible. So this is the body of the mandible, ramus of the mandible. All right, this is the coronary process, and this is the condylar process here. So this is the coronary, this is the sticky one. The pointed one is the coronary process, and this is the condylar process, where this is the condyle, and this basically the condyle articulates, attaches with the condylar fossa of the temporal bone. So this is the part of the temporal bone, and this is the condylar process or condyle of the mandible, and articulates and attaches with the condylar fossa of the temporal bone, forming TMJ. What we call it TMJ. TMJ refers to as the temporal mandibular joint. So this is temporal mandibular joint, TMJ. Okay. So this is the condylar process or condyles of the mandible. This is the mandibular notch, the ramus of the mandible, the body of the mandible. This is the angle. This is the mental foramen, and this is the this is the mandibular foramen. The mental foramen, mandibular foramen. Again, we have another foramen on the inner aspect of the ramus. Okay, this is the inner aspect of the ramus, and this area here. You see, so this mandibular foramen, you have the inferior alveolar nerve, and this is this nerve basically is part of the the trigeminal nerve passes through, and some of these nerves comes out from here. This is the mental foramen, where the mental nerves comes out from here. So the mental foramen, and this is the mandibular foramen. Okay, mandibular foramen, mental foramen. This is the body of the mandible, ramus of the mandible, coronary process, and this is the mandibular process. All right. Okay, that's a bit about it. So let's look at the lateral view now. So if we look at the lateral view, what we see here is primarily, then we put the calvaria. So on the lateral view we have, what do we see here? We have the frontal bone, we have the parietal bone here, frontal bone, parietal bone, we have the temporal bone here, all right? We have the zygomatic bone here. Here we have the sphenoid. So this is part of the greater ring of sphenoid. Greater ring of sphenoid, frontal bone, parietal bone, the squamous part of the temporal bone. This is zygomatic arch, zygomatic bone, zygomatic arch. We have the external auditory meatus here, external acoustic meatus, which is the ear, external ear canal. Okay, put the mandible here. And then we have the, just behind that we have the mastoid process here. We have the mastoid process here. Okay, so if we get this out of the way. Okay, so we have the temporal fossa, and then we have the infratemporal fossa over here. And this is the occipital bone at the back here, the occipital bone. Okay, so what we see here, basically, so we talked about the mandibular arch, or I'm sorry, the zygomatic arch, or zygoma. We talked about the zygomatic arch is composed. Let's repeat. It's composed of the temporal process, the temporal process of the of zygomatic bone, and then we have it unites with the zygomatic arch, zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So these two unite and they form what we call a zygomatic arch. Okay, so we talked about that. Temporal fossa, infratemporal fossa. So beneath the zygomatic arch, we have the infratemporal fossa here, this area here. Okay, and behind the zygomatic arch, above that, we have the temporal fossa. Okay, and basically this is the mastoid process is important. Mastoid process is the mastoid. This resembles the what we call as like we call that like mastectomy. I mean, if you remember mastectomy, what is mastectomy? Is the mammary gland. Okay, the mammary gland resembles as that's why it's referred to as mastoid process. And mastoid process is basically forms the attachment, provides attachment point for three important muscles: sternocleidomastoid, splenius capitis, and longissimus capitis. So this sternocleidomastoid, splenius capitis, and longissimus capitis forms the these are attached on the mastoid process. Beneath that we have the stylomastoid, styloid process. Just beneath the external auditory meatus, we have the sticky, pointy, stick-like structure. We have this is styloid process. And styloid process also, we're going to look at this at it a bit detail in the when we look at the base of the skull. This is the styloid process. Okay, so this basically is the lateral view of the skull. And what else do we have here? And we talked about pterion, right? We talked about pterion. And on the one other thing on the lateral view is that this area is occupied by a muscle, what we call as temporalis muscle. So we have the temporalis muscle originates from this area here and attached to the coronary process. All right. And basically, and then we have another muscle that attached to the ramus of the mandible. This is the masseter muscle, and these two muscles, temporalis muscle and masseter muscle, is important in mastication. And they lift up the mandible, and they are important in mastication. So we have the temporalis muscle, the masseter muscle. Okay, this area. Okay, so this is about it from the lateral view. Okay, now let's look at the let's look at the interior view, or this area too. Okay,